Hey everyone, in this video we're going to talk about workflows in your full stack applications. So you've probably seen that Vercel just launched their Workflow DevKit, and I think this type of tool is going to be a game changer for building full stack applications, because many of the difficult things in building full stack applications actually have to do with the backend. So if you've ever tried to build something with background jobs or cron jobs or like bool MQ and like a queuing system, and actually many other backend features as well, you know how much friction that still has. Whereas on the front end, a lot of that complexity has been solved in many ways with React, for example. But on the back end, we still have to glue together a bunch of disjointed services. There are tools now that will help you with this. So in this video, we'll take a look at how the Workflow DevKit works. Basically, you define a workflow and you have steps in that workflow. So you can set up a background job, for example. This can help you with building AI agents, and it typically comes with retrying and some way to sleep without using resources while you're waiting. Also some streaming capability here, even something with hooks. I'll show you this in the video. Now, just to show you an example. So I have a Next.js application here, and I have created a post. Now this post is not live yet. It's just a draft. Before we actually publish it live publicly, we may want to do some processing on this post. For example, we may want to check if it contains spam. Right? Maybe we allow people to create posts before we actually make them live for everyone. We want to check if it's spam. We may also want to enrich the post with some SEO metadata. Maybe we want to create a summary of the post, and maybe we want to create a good title here for the tab, right? And some other things. But let me actually just show you here. So I'm going to click on Start Workflow here below this. You can see Starting Workflow. It's going to do a spam check for this post. It's going to do some enrichment after that. So we're getting updates here, right? So I'm streaming to the UI here. We'll talk about streaming. Now here is really interesting. There needs to be an admin that manually approves or rejects the post at this point. So we have like a human in the loop situation here. But let's say I like it, I can click on approve, and then the workflow continues, right? So we can sort of stop the workflow after human approval or rejection, right? So after that, it actually will publish it, basically just update it in the database to make it a status. Now, Next.js, we have a lot of caching. So we also need some way to bust the cache in many workflows. So we are also taking a look at that, and ultimately it is completed here. So this type of workflow, running this in the background, this used to be so much work, but now it's actually really easy thanks to these tools. So I'm really happy to see the space grow. If I now refresh, you can see the post here has now has a status of published. So we are finished here. Now, if that sounds familiar, it's probably because you've seen other tools that were already able to do something like that. And me personally, I've actually really enjoyed using Motia to do many of these things. They're sponsoring the channel, and they're actually part of Vercel's open source program. You can check them out here on GitHub. But Motia allows you to do many of those things as well. So background jobs, cron jobs. But Motia has been around for longer. So they have some things that I think really make it stand out. In particular, they have a really amazing streaming capability. So it makes streaming a result to the user's browser really easy, so you don't have to do polling or other gnarly setup. It's just adding a React component to your app. I'll show you that as well. So the DevKit, as of recording, is for TypeScript. With Motia, I can use TypeScript, but also Python. And with Motia, I can do some other advanced things as well, like even configure some infrastructure here. So for example, I can say for this handler, for that step, I want to allocate this much RAM, for example, or I want to give it a particular maximum execution time, or even CPU allocation, right? So just to give you a sense of how advanced Motia can get. And you can read more about that vision here in this manifesto here on Motia's website, which will give you more context around this entire space. But overall, I think it's really exciting to see these tools grow, because they can really take away a lot of complexity from the back end. So let me actually show you how we can implement this with the tools that we have. I'll show you the Workflow DevKit first. All right, so let's actually take a look at how we can implement this with the Workflow DevKit. So like I said, I have a Next.js application, and here we just have one page. I'm just displaying a post here, and then below that we have this workflow section. So here in my Next.js code, I just have the page, right? It's just a page for a particular post in the database. So we just need to grab the post from the database, and we just have a bunch of markup here. So we're displaying the status and the title of the post, right? So we have status and title, and then we have the content of the post right here. Okay, now if the post is in draft mode, I want to render this workflow section here. So that's what I do here. So if it's in draft mode, we have this workflow section. So how does that work? So if I click on it, you can see we're starting a workflow here, And remember, a workflow is just a series of steps. So we want to do these steps one by one. And then here we have a human in the loop step. If I approve it, it will continue doing other steps, right? So we have a bunch of steps here. So before we actually look at how we can trigger the workflow, let's actually see what this workflow looks like in code, and then we'll see how we can actually trigger it with this button. So first we need to set up this workflow DevKit in our Next.js application. They have a starter guide here. So we need to install the workflow package. It's actually called workflow. So I went ahead and did that right here. The next thing you need to do is you need to actually wrap the Next.js config with a function with workflow here. And they do mention optionally you can also add this to your TS config for some extra type benefit. And if you have middleware or what's now called proxy, then they also mention adding this to the proxy. I'm not using that in the app, so I won't do that. So that is the setup in a Next.js application. So you can see it's pretty tightly integrated with your app. So then we can get started with actual code. So I have created a new folder here in my app. I call it workflows. We could have different types of workflows. In this case, it's a workflow for publishing a post, right? We just have one file. Now in that file, I'm exporting one function here. I'm calling it publish post workflow. Notice at the top here, it has a string directive called use workflow. So in Next.js, we have use server. We also have use client. We actually also have use cache now. So we have a bunch of string directives now. Some people don't really like it. There is some debate about it. But when you do that, this function becomes special. So in our example here, the first thing we want to do here is check that post for spam. So I'm putting that code in a separate function. So here I have the function for checking spam. Notice here I have the string directive use step. So this is meant to be used in a function that is a workflow function. And this will become one piece of that whole workflow, right? One step. And the benefit is if we do something in here, for example, gets an error, it will automatically be retried. So by default, it will actually be retried 3 times. So, and there are other benefits here, and I'll show you that in a second. But basically, you compose together a workflow by combining steps, right? So this is one piece and it can be independently retried. So what I'm doing here is I'm trying to grab the exact post from my database. Now, what if there is no post? We actually want to throw an error here. Now, if I would throw a normal error, it will actually automatically retry this step. But in this case, if there is no post in the database, it really shouldn't be retrying. It would just be a waste. So in that case, I can throw a fatal error and then it won't be retried. Okay, so then we actually have a post, let's say, and we can check if it is spam. So here I just have some basic example here of just checking for some banned terms. And so if it is actually spam, we want to throw a fatal error so it stops and it won't be retried. Now, I could actually also make a call to an AI model and I can just use the AI SDK, for example, to do that in here, right? So this is just about the flow of the code. But you can still use the AI SDK in here to make actual calls to an AI model, for example, to check for spam or other things. Now, just for the demo here, I'm adding some time so we can simulate a call to an AI model. It might take multiple seconds, right? So in practice, this would probably take a few seconds. So you can imagine if you have a workflow that with quite a few steps, that can take 10 seconds, 30 seconds. If you're using the latest AI models and the thinking models, can take multiple minutes actually. So if you're building Next.js application and trying to fit that in the request response cycle, it's a really difficult thing to do. So this is one of the benefits of using these workflows. We can sort of separate out this logic from that standard request response cycle into its own dedicated workflow and compose it with steps. So in this case, I'm just using this promise trick that you can do to just sleep a bit in JavaScript. Now, one note here is that when you sleep like this, from my understanding, it will still consume resources. So if you do something like this to basically wait, it will still use a function under the hood, for example, a serverless function. However, the workflow kit also exports a function actually called sleep. My understanding is in that case, it will actually wait as well without consuming resources. So that's how I understand it, but it seems like you cannot use it in a step directly. You have to use it in the actual workflow function. I'll show you that in a second. So that is one step. If it fails, it will be automatically retried. Here is the second step. So once we know that, right, if it turns out to be spam, it throws a fatal error and it stops. Now, if it succeeds, we go to the next step. In this case, I want to enrich the post with some metadata, let's say. So that's another function with use step at the top. I'm grabbing the post from the database here again. If it can't find a post, there's no point in retrying. So I'm deliberately throwing a fatal error here. And then we can make another AI call, for example, with the AI SDK, in this case, to get an actual summary or other metadata. So in this case, I'm just generating a summary of the post myself. And I'm just adding some time here to add some space in between, just to simulate how this would work if you make actual AI calls. So those are the first two steps in the workflow here. They will run sequentially. So first this one and then that one. However, you can also run them in parallel. So they show an example here of using promise.all, and you can just use those functions in that array, and they should run in parallel in that case. However, I actually want them to run sequentially here because I don't even want to enrich the post if it turns out to be spam, right? So sequential here makes more sense in my view. All right, so then we get to a really interesting part here, which is suddenly before the workflow can continue, it needs to get actual input from a human. So a person, actually an admin user, let's say, has to actually manually approve or reject the post. Right, so here we have to wait for basically user input. So this is traditionally really tricky to do, but actually it's really interesting how they try to solve this. So they have a create hook. We have a hook here, and we can simply await that hook. Right. So remember, I can click on the accept or reject button. So if I click on the accept button, there is another function I can call from my app called resume hook. And when that is called, it will actually continue down here. So then the workflow here continues. So this will basically pause the workflow. So just to show you that here in the Next.js app, remember that at some point I could click on approve or reject, right? So at some point we can render buttons in the UI that are approve or reject. And if the user clicks on approve, I can use a server action in this case, but could work with an API endpoint as well. The point is, at some point I can call resume hook from somewhere in my app, continue the workflow, right? And if the user clicks on the approve button, well, it would be true. And if the user clicked on reject, it would be false. Ultimately, the workflow here is paused until we have a decision on that. And so when resume hook is called, we can continue here. This will resolve and we have a result. Now, if the user rejected it, we can throw a fatal error to basically exit the workflow. Otherwise, we can just continue. Okay, now these hooks, they work with a so-called token. By default, it will generate some random token here. And then if you want to resume the workflow, you need to call resume hook with that same token. By default, it's a random token. So I'm actually not sure how you can get the random token somewhere else in your app, but you can generate a custom token here. And I think it makes sense to do this based on the ID of the post for which this workflow is running. So that you can reconstruct the token somewhere else in your app later. So in this case, I have a post ID with a particular ID. So then when I resume the hook, I just need to reconstruct that token manually here myself. Right, so that's basically how we can do like a human in the loop type of step. Now let's say it was approved. So we continue here, and now we actually want to publish the post, but we don't immediately want to post it. We want to only post, let's say, on only at 9 a.m. So maybe our publication only posts things online at 9 a.m., right? So maybe we have some specific schedule for that. So now, before I actually call publish post, I want to wait until 9 a.m. Now I can use that sleep function. So from my understanding, we can only use the sleep function directly in use workflow. It seems not to work for me in a use step function. So it has to be at the top level, you could say. And so you can just use a date object and you can specify until what date it needs to sleep essentially. The cool thing is the workflow will pause until that time without consuming resources. So this is different from using the trick with new promise set timeout, right? So if you would do this, this would actually keep the function, the underlying function running and would consume resources. With this, my understanding at least is that it actually pauses the workflow without consuming resources. That's the benefit from using that sleep function that we can import from that workflow package as well. Now in this case, just for the demo here, I'm just gonna sleep for 5 seconds. So you can also specify 5 seconds or 1 hour, right? So 30 minutes, something like this. I believe even like 1 year or something like that. So you have your standard syntax for this. So ultimately the waiting is over and we continue and the workflow continues here. What am I doing here? Publish post is another step here, and I'm actually only updating the database. So I'm just going to flip the status of that post to actually publish, right? So then we can have some render logic to actually display the post on the front end basically. Now in Next.js we do a lot of caching as well. So typically you do want to revalidate cache when you have workflows like this as well. So that can be another step. And so here we have another use step. I'm calling revalidate tag if I have cached that post. Right, so Next.js actually has a new caching architecture. I'll have a separate video on this soon. But typically we tag a particular piece of data so that later we can bust the cache. Right, so you can see we're combining these steps to compose a complete workflow. And there are many benefits to that. It basically allows us to have these long-running tasks in the background, which is traditionally really hard to do in a plain Next.js app. But you also get things like automatic retrying. So if one of those steps fails, it can be retried by itself. So basically we've now defined our workflow, right? It's just a function with use workflow, and in there you have other functions with use step. So once you've defined a workflow, it needs to actually be triggered. So in this case, I want to trigger it when a user clicks this button in my UI. So how do we trigger that? So here I have a button in my UI, and when the user clicks it, I'm running this function start workflow. Now this needs to make an API call to my own Next.js backend. So I have a route handler, an API endpoint, and it will send along the ID of the post. So here I have that route handler. So this is on my Next.js server side. And what we can do in here, we know the ID for which we want to run that workflow. So now I can finally trigger the workflow, and I need to do it from the server side. So that's why I'm first making an API call to my own Next.js server side. And I need to use the start function here from workflow. So that's how I trigger it, right? So you get start here, and then you need to specify which workflow you want to run, right? Because remember, you can have multiple workflows. Well, it's going to be this function, and I can pass in some arguments here. So in this case, I want to pass in the ID of the post. This workflow will be triggered, right? And you get the ID of the post in here, just like a normal function, and you can pass it along just like you're used to. So let's actually go ahead and try it out. So this will now run if we click that button. So let's actually click on. Okay, so I just clicked here, but we do not see any updates here because I didn't implement streaming yet. So very often we want to stream some result or some progress to the user as well. So how has this workflow DevKit implemented streaming? So how do you set up streaming here? So the way it works is you need to write to a stream and you need to consume a stream. So to write to a stream, we can do get writable, and you get some variable here. And what I want to do is for each step, I want to write something to that stream. So I'm going to pass the writable here to each step. So for example, I'm passing it to spam. So I'm passing it here to the spam step. And here I'm getting that writable. So I'm passing it here. And then here I have to get the writer, and then I can write something to it. So the syntax here is a little bit gnarly, but ultimately I did get it to work like this. So basically in each step, you just write to the stream. Right? In this case, I'm writing starting the spam check ... So I'm doing that for each step. So in each step, I'm doing something like starting enrichment ... Right? Here in publishing, I'm doing something like publishing post ... So basically writing to the stream in each step. And then you need to consume the stream as well on the front end. So we can actually get the updates and render the UI based on that. So when you start the workflow, you get something back here. So it's an actual instance of the workflow, an actual run. And one of the things we can do with that is get access to that stream with get readable. Okay, remember this is on our Next.js server side. So ultimately we do have to pass it back with a response here. So passing it back with stream, and then we need a particular header here as well. So here on the front end, when we click on that start workflow button, we make that API call, but we get a response, and that's gonna contain the stream, right? So here, ultimately, we get the response. Now the syntax is not great, so you have to do a bunch of processing here to actually turn it into usable data and make it, and so we can easily render it. So ultimately, I got it to work with some code, but that's basically how you consume the stream, right? So you get the data here, those starting spam check ... and I'm just storing that here in React state. And then based on the state, I can render some markup, right? So just a list of logs essentially. So for each of those updates, I just have an li. But I did need to do a bunch of manual processing here. But ultimately, if you do that, and now I click on start workflow, you will see that you can see now we do get some actual updates. So starting spam check, ... starting enrichment, ... And now we have that human in the loop approval step. So remember, you can do that with create hook, and it will just pause the workflow until you call resume hook somewhere else in your app. Right, so here I'm just rendering some buttons and it will call resume hook. So if I click on approve, it's approval granted, continuing ... And we're also sleeping 5 seconds here. Now I did run into a small issue, which is that after resuming the hook, it seems to hang a bit here. And I think it's because there is an issue with resuming the hook properly. So I couldn't read much about it. Maybe I'm making a mistake, but it seems like if you use a token that was already used for a previous run of the workflow, it may detect that that previous run was already completed. So it may not continue at that point. At least that's my understanding. So if I just change something about the token here and then also use that here for resume hook, and now I restart everything and retry the workflow here. Now I can approve again, and now you can see it actually does continue. So maybe I'm doing something wrong with the token there, but ultimately I got it to work and everything works fine here. And now if I refresh the page, you can see the post is actually published. We cannot automatically update the UI without refreshing here. So because this is basically running outside that request response cycle when we click start workflow. Right, we're basically doing what they call fire and forget pattern here. Right, so we're starting the workflow, and we're not waiting for it, we're just immediately returning something. So we cannot return the updated UI at this point yet because it's not ready yet, right? But there are some other patterns as well, like wait for completion, if you do want that. So here they show you an example of that. Now, of course, we're running these workflows, but where can we see those runs? Is there some observability perhaps? Can we see what happened in these runs? Well, yes, there is the npx workflow inspect. And what do you want to inspect? Well, the runs in this case. So if I do that, you can see there will be a list of basically invocations of that workflow. Now this is in the CLI. If you do prefer a UI, they have -- web here as well, and it will spin up a view here where you can visually inspect it as well. So you can see I have a bunch of runs here over the past few days. Whenever you call that start function to run a workflow, that will be one run. And here you can see of that particular run what actually happened. So you can see the total workflow took 16 seconds. And then you can also see for each step how long it took. So the spam check took about 3 seconds. The next one also 3 seconds. And then we had to wait for approval, right? So that was granted. And then we slept for 5 seconds. And then we have these other steps that took 2 seconds each. Right? You can then also try to rerun, or if one is still running, right? So actually I have one that's still running here, but I can cancel from here as well. So I can cancel the run like this. They categorize my setup as an embedded version. So you can see here under .next, it will actually create a folder here called workflow data. And I also have this well-known folder in here as well. So it's very tightly coupled with my Next.js application. So it looks like what I did is called an embedded world, but you can also deploy to Vercel and use the Vercel world. And there may be other worlds available out there as well. So I think the DevKit is great, but Motia does have some really interesting differentiators. So let's actually take a look at Motia as well. So first of all, actually, you can use Python here. So if you have, maybe you already have a bunch of Python code, or you have developers on your team that want to use Python, you can have steps. Motia also has steps, but you can do that both in TypeScript and Python. Motia makes streaming, in my view, a little bit easier as well. They have some more advanced configuration options as well, like infrastructure options. And they actually have some amazing examples here for certain AI workflows. So I highly recommend you check those out. But let's actually take a look at our example here. So remember, we have a post, and now I'm going to start a workflow here. And this time it's Motia that is running this in the background here on the backend. So you can see I still have my updates. It's still being streamed. I still have a human in the loop approval here, or reject if I want. And it's going to publish and revalidate the cache. And ultimately it is finished, right? So I've been doing this type of workflow with Motia for some time. I've had a great time using it. So remember, with the Vercel Workflow DevKit, it was really embedded inside our application. With Motia, it works a bit differently. So Motia is actually a separate application. So you can see here I have my Next.js app, and then very commonly how you would do it with a separate backend is that you would have another app with the things you want to do on the backend. Now, to actually run both of them at the same time, what you can do is you can just run the Next.js app on the left side, let's say, and then the Motia app on the right side. Okay, so here you can see it has steps. So let's take a look at how we can define that workflow here in Motia. The basics are very similar, so it also is about steps. So in Motia, everything is essentially a step. So here I have steps here for my posts workflow, and it starts off with this step here because since it's a separate application, my Next.js app first has to call into the Motia app to get started. And we can just do that with an API endpoint. So I can set up an API endpoint here with Motia. It's just a step. Each step has a config and a handler for that. So the config here is going to be with type API, but can also be type event. For example, step here emits an event. Other steps can subscribe to that event. So you get a very event-driven workflow. So conceptually, it's actually very easy. Right, so but this step gets that request. We can do some validation if we want, or we can set up a stream. We'll talk about it in a second. But ultimately, it emits an event. It can be with some data, can be a particular topic, and then there can be other steps that subscribe to that. So in this case, when there is an event of spam check, right, I have another step, this one here. So you define it in files here. So and this one also has a config object and a handler, and it subscribes to that particular event. Right? And it itself can then also emit another event, which other steps can subscribe to. Right? So you get into a very event-driven type of workflow here. Conceptually, it makes it very easy to reason about your workflows, but also you can have multiple steps subscribe to the same event. So you can like fan out to multiple steps. And notice that these steps, they always have a config and a handler. So the syntax here is very similar to what you're already used to. It's not a new like exotic string directive, right? So the form factor here is a little bit more traditional, like what you're used to. And then so in this step, what we're doing here is, well, we may actually do a spam check, and we can use the AI SDK for this. Right, so you can make an API call to an AI model in here, right? So with these workflows, we're just determining how it should run, the flow of the flow basically, right? And with retrying, right? So Motia also will automatically retry if there is a failure here, right? So all of the basics are in here in Motia as well. So ultimately we're emitting another event. In this case, it's the enrichment step, and so you may make another API call to an AI model for that as well. Now remember, in our workflow, at some point we want to approve or reject, so like a human in the loop. So how would I do that with Motia? Well, it's actually really easy because it can just be another API call to an API endpoint. The API endpoints here are super easy to set up. So the only thing I have to do for my Next.js application is make a call to whatever path I choose here. It should be a post request. And so then my Motia workflow will know whether the admin has approved it or rejected it. If the admin has approved it, we can simply emit a different event from if it was rejected, right? So we're sort of branching off our workflow here based on the approval decision, right? And until the decision has been received, there's nothing going on. We're not running anything. It's just an API endpoint here, just listening for incoming requests. And until then, well, nothing is happening here, right? Which is what we want. Now, if it's approved, emitting that publish event, it's being subscribed to it by this step. This step will perhaps update it in a database, and ultimately we need to revalidate the caching as well in our Next.js app. So we have one final step. So I have a step for that as well, which actually works a bit differently. It will just make a call back into my Next.js app, right? So my Motia app can also call back into my Next.js app. It's very common actually that you have like a API endpoint for that. If you've ever used an external CMS system, if you're making a change in your content, you typically need to make sure there's like an API call to your app so you can revalidate the cache for that particular piece of content. So in this case, I have a route handler at this location with this path here in my Next.js app. So we just have to call in there so we can bust the cache. Now I like to have like a finalize step here as well, so that we have like a clear end point of the workflow, and we may actually want to do some cleanup or other things, right? So these steps right now, I have them in TypeScript, but can be in Python as well in Motia. And if you quickly want to visually inspect your workflow, when you start the Motia app, it will automatically open up your Workbench as well. So in this case, I automatically have this Workbench available here on my local host, which actually has a really nice visualization here of my complete workflow. So you can see I have one API endpoint to kick off the workflow. We first do a spam check, and then we do an enrichment step, right? And then we have that human in the loop approval process. So that's another API endpoint. And here we're branching off. So if it's approved, we can publish it. If it's rejected, we have some logic for rejection. If it's approved, we can just revalidate it. We can publish it and revalidate, and then we have some final step here. And if I want to see the logic of these steps, I can click on here and I can see the exact code for that particular step as well. I can see my endpoints here. So I have 2 in this case. Right, so with Motia, I can build out a complete backend application. And we have some tracing and observability here as well. So I can see for each invocation of the workflow, how long it took and the steps, how long they took. So here the spam check took 2.2 seconds. We can see the event that it's been emitting and also streams. So let me show you that as well. So how are we able to display this in the UI? Basically the progress here with Motia. So with Motia, you set up basically just a config here, defining what the stream should look like. And then in each step, I can sort of write to it or set some data on it. So in this case, I'm setting some data on that stream, and I can do that in each step. So that's basically writing to the stream. Now, if I want to consume it in my Next.js application, right, I just have to wrap part of my app that I want to give access to that stream with the Motia stream provider. So this is actually really nice experience. I think it can serve as an example of how it should be done. But they basically give you a provider component that you can just add to your React app. So if you do this, you can then consume the stream from my Next.js app, right? So if you want to consume the stream in a component, there is a hook use stream item, which I get from Motia's package here as well, which will give me the data of that stream right here inside my Next.js app. So based on that data, I can then render the right markup. I'm just calling it logs here. Right, so I'm just creating an LI here for each of those items. And that's how we're able to get the updates right here in the UI. So this is a really nice developer experience. There's very little setup from my part to get this into the UI. Traditionally, a lot of work with polling, server-side events. So I think this is a really good example of how this space can implement streaming, because it's really easy to do so. Even though the Motia app is a separate application, right? So you would expect there to be a lot of setup and a lot of hassle, but that's actually not the case. It's actually really easy. Right, so let's try one more time. It's really satisfying to see it work. So when I click on the start workflow button, in this case, I do need to trigger the Motia workflow, right? So from my Next.js app, I just have to make an API call to the API endpoint that we are exposing in the Motia app, right? So we set up a path, right? So we set up a path for that, and it's just a simple network call. We can pass along the post ID, and that will trigger the workflow, right? So now if we have wired everything up, we get this result. We get the updates right here streamed in. I'm going to approve here, and it will continue streaming actually, revalidating cache, and the workflow is complete now. So imagine just 1 or 2 years ago how much work this would have been. So far we've been running like background jobs. Now what about cron jobs? What if you want to run something once a minute or once a day or once a week? So in Vercel's DevKit, technically you could try making that work. You could perhaps try using the sleep function and have some kind of loop. But with Motia, everything is a step. So this is also a step. In this case, it's of type cron, and you specify the cron here, for example, every minute, and then you have your handler here again. So you may prefer the syntax here with Motia because it may conceptually be a bit easier to think of everything as a step and just have an explicit type for a cron job. This code is actually from the previous video I did with Motia in the 10-stack start video I created, in which I explain all about 10-stack start, including how to integrate a backend framework like Motia into it. So I highly recommend you check out the previous video as well. So I'm really happy with both Motia as well as the DevKit. I think there are 2 amazing tools here. Now Motia has been around for a bit longer, and so they have some options that I showed you that are a bit more advanced. So for example, the configuration for those steps that I showed you, you can fine tune them in many ways. So you can even, right, so you can specify them in Python. You can specify their infrastructure configuration even. Now Motia also has a more explicit way to manage state. I can persist some data between steps, for example. Right, so you can just set something to state like this and then get that piece of data like that. And they also have some really amazing advanced examples of what you can do. So I highly recommend you check them out. It's actually very likely that what you're building is similar to some of these examples that they have here. Right, some advanced AI agents here. They actually have an amazing chess arena website here where the AI models are playing against each other, all built with Motia. And it's all open source. You can find it here on GitHub. So you can get really advanced with Motia. To deploy Motia, they actually offer Motia Cloud as a recording. And I can also self-host Motia here with Docker. And there's much more. They have plugins, they have middleware, they help you with testing as well. So I highly recommend that you try out Motia. Check out the link in the description. If you just quickly want to try it out locally, you can just run npx Motia at latest create to quickly spin up a demo Motia application. It will show you the basics, including the workbench, and it's the easiest way to get started with Motia. In any case, it's really amazing what these tools can do for us. If you've built full stack applications with Next.js in the past and it was time to get started with backend features, you know how much trouble this was. Even simple background jobs used to be a major hassle. So it's really nice to see the space grow, and I really like both the DevKit as well as Motia. I think they're really pulling the space forward. So I hope this helps you out with building your workflows. In any case, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.